Hey guys, Dylan here. Welcome back to the Minecraft Animation Workshop. We're going to be talking about rendering and how to finalize your video, your animation. So we have the lighting set up and that's great. And if you don't know what rendering is, it's basically taking that light and calculating it to a final state where you know exactly where all the calculations are and it outputs the final version of your scene with all the materials and shaders applied, refractions, reflections, diffuse, shadows, all that stuff. So that stuff usually doesn't happen real time because in order to calculate that, it takes up a lot of computer resources. So the people who made 3D software made it so that you can do all the stuff in the viewport as a very basic preview version of your stuff, and then when you render it, it'll sort of output and put all the time into finalizing it before each frame, so that way you can make things look good without hindering your process of actually making the animation while you're working. So we're going to go ahead and show you guys exactly how to do it in Cycles and Blender Render. We're going to start with Cycles first because it's more popular, and we're going to go over the basic settings as well as how to do depth of field. I think that's part of the rendering process because it's sort of the finalization, the polish, or the final touch of your animation that you can add. So real quick, let's start off by going from our animation workspace back to our default workspace, just because I think that gives us a little bit more room to work with. I want to show you guys exactly how to use the render settings tab, which is right here. On the very left hand side of your properties menu, there is a camera, a little camera icon thing. That's your render settings. So you can always press render here or press F12, as you guys already know. And this animation button, the render animation, is actually the Control F12 hotkey, which actually will render out every single frame on your timeline as opposed to just one frame, which F12 does, only one frame. So you have that. You also have the device here, CPU or GPU. If you don't see GPU on here, I recommend going to Control Alt U and going to System, and then making sure the Cycles compute device has CUDA enabled, which will have your graphics card listed here if you have a compatible graphics card. That will allow you to choose GPU here, which does speed up your render. It doesn't work for too complex scenes because GPU also has a limited RAM. So I do recommend trying it out, seeing how it works. If it works and doesn't fail, then totally use GPU. It's much faster. But CPU is a little bit more reliable since it's an older technology. Now you don't have to worry about open shading language for Minecraft. Next is the dimensions. We're going to go ahead and set our resolution here. As you guys may have heard of 1080p, 720p. 1080p is sort of the holy grail right now of internet content, or if anything, most content. So 1920 pixels by 1080 pixels is the definition of 1080p. It's HD, and we can actually set that right here. But there is a slider down here that's usually set at 50%. I recommend bringing that up to 100% if you don't want to have bad resolution, because when you bring it down to 50%, that's basically only for preview renders while you're working, so that it doesn't take too long to get a good idea of what you are rendering. But when you output the final version, you want to drag that out to 100% because it is going to be HD if you do, and it's going to be low resolution if you don't. So that will make sure that it's 100% of the resolution that you specified. The frame range is the same thing as over here, so don't worry about that. Your frame rate should be 24, but here is the output, and the output is where you really want to specify where your files are going to go. This is important because you also want to make sure what kind of file type you have. But let's go ahead and change this to something like, I'm going to bring it to the Minecraft Workshop, go to Renders, right, and I'll go ahead and click here and say Test Render 01 or 012. It doesn't matter what the name is, it's up to you. So we're going to go ahead and go there. Inside the folder, hit accept, and now it'll have all my file path there. You can actually go here and hit relative path, which makes things a little bit cleaner because it's a relative path to the file's location. So that's pretty nice. And then the file type here, I recommend keeping it at PNG and then turning on RGBA just in case, because this will allow you to store each frame as a separate image file, and that's how we want to render. I'll show you guys that in a second, but some people may be tempted to simply be like, okay, well, I'm rendering out a video, I want a video, so I'm going to output an FFmpeg video and change the encoding to MP4 because MP4 is what I want, and so I'm going to render that. And the problem with that is when you render, if you hit Control F12, it's one single process that renders out, and when it finishes that process, it saves out the movie file. But if it at any time it's interrupted during that rendering process, the movie file will not be complete. It won't have the cap at the end that sort of closes the file, so it won't be readable. It's a corrupt file. So the problem with that is even if you rendered everything but the last frame, you won't be able to use that video file anymore. You have to start over. So you have to start over the rendering process. And some renders can take up to a day or weeks or months to render. So you don't want to, ideally not months, but I've had that happen to me before. You don't want to render something and have to redo it because it's such a waste of time. You have electric bills to pay. So I recommend making it a PNG, because if you do that, you'll be able to stitch together the images from before you canceled, if you happen to cancel the job, and then only render the rest of it and bring everything back together into one file later on. It's much more manageable and much more efficient. And it's also what all the big studios do. So listen to them, if not me. So I recommend PNG, and I'm actually going to keep it at RGB because we don't need an alpha channel since we have a skybox already in the scene. But if you do have RGBA, that will give you an alpha layer as well. So if you have any kind of a transparency that you want to, like for example, take the skybox out and just have it transparent there and then add the skybox in later in post, you can, but we're not going to go over that. So we're just going to keep it at RGB for now. And then we're going to go ahead and go into our camera settings here and select our camera, go to the camera settings, and this is the video camera icon, not the other icon, but this one. This camera icon, you have a couple options here that you can play around with. And I want to play around with the depth of field real quick. I want to show you guys how to do that before we hit the render button, just so I can show you what it can do. The depth of field is very easy in Cycles because it's much more natural. It's all in the scene, so you can have a focus point and you can have a radius size of the aperture and stuff like that that will set the blur and stuff. So we're going to go ahead and create an empty. I'm just going to click his leg here and then hit Shift A, empty, and I like to use sphere just for the DOF. DOF stands for depth of field. I'm going to hit N, rename this to DOF. That's what I like to call it anyway. And then we can just go into our camera settings by clicking the camera again, making sure the camera settings are selected. And for focus, you can either eyedropper tool it here and just eyedropper tool the DOF right there, and that will allow you to focus that. If you want to see if it worked or not, go ahead and check limits on under display for the camera settings and move outside of it, and you'll see with limits on, you'll actually be able to see where the depth of field is focused onto. So as you can see, it works just fine because that yellow cross represents how far it's focusing. So that will be perfect. We're also going to go down here, and for the aperture size, we're going to change this to a number probably like 0.01 or something like that. The units are in meters, so 0.01 is something like centimeters. So 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters, something like that. So now that we have that set, I'm going to go ahead and hit Shift Z to get a real-time render going on, just to preview exactly how this will look, because the depth of field will be in the viewport render as well. Let's just wait for this to sort of mellow out and sample all the way through. And we'll talk about samples in a little bit as well. As you can see here, it's pretty nice, but it's not that blurry in the background. You can't really tell, especially since it's pixely. So I want to exaggerate a little bit just to show you guys how it works. I'm going to do 0.1 instead of 0.01, which is an order of magnitude 10 more intense. And as you can see here, it's very, very intense now. The background is blurry, the foreground is blurry, and only the part with the character and the cake in there, that plane, is going to be clear. So this is what depth of field does, and you can adjust how blurry things are and how shallow your depth of field is simply by adjusting the radius on your camera settings. So I recommend playing around with that setting a little bit. Don't make it too blurry, like this is way too blurry. Just a quick tip for the depth of field: when things are too blurry, they look smaller, they look miniaturized, because when you have a shallow depth of field like that, that's usually only seen when you're looking at something really small relative to the camera. So I recommend having something like, you know, 0.02 or 0.05, something about half as intense as this at the very most. So, but yeah, this is a good example of what you want to do. So I'm just going to go ahead and do 0.05. And I'm going to leave it at that. Don't let it render all the way through for the viewport, but it does look pretty good already. I think that's not bad. It's a little too intense, actually. So I want to bring this back to probably 0.02, which is about double of our original. And I think that will be good enough without testing. I'll just render it out later on. Now, I'm going to go ahead and talk about sampling real quick because we were talking about sampling earlier. If you go to the render settings again and go down to sampling down here, this is where you kind of determine how many samples you want cycles to iterate through, like how many times you want it to calculate the light calculations to make sure it's right, basically. So it will do that usually pretty well, and samples usually range between, like, you know, 50 to 1,000 depending on how many samples and how clear you want the image to be. Luckily in 2.79 there is denoising. Denoising is fantastic. It denoises the render so that you can use lower samples and still have a good quality render. So in this example we have 128 frames by default. So in this scene, we already have 128 samples set for the render. By default, I think that's a little too high. Actually, we could probably go down to something like 50. The preview render here is at 32. This is whenever you hit Shift-Z in the viewport, that's how far it goes, just to make sure it doesn't waste too much time. You can also set this to 0 if you ever want to, just as a quick tip, to have it keep going on infinitely, just to test out how many samples you really need. But But I think 50 is going to be good, especially with the new denoiser. So if you want to turn on the denoiser, just simply go to the render layers here and then click denoising under the render layer that you are using right now. So that will have, all the default settings are fine in my experience. So just use the default settings for now and it will improve your render greatly from a noisy render to a perfectly clean render. So hitting F12 here will give us a good idea of what that does. But this is going to take a little bit of time because it's full resolution, so I'll get back to you guys in a few minutes when the render is done. So once we've done all that, all of our settings are good to go. If we go to the render settings here, yes, everything is good. Our file path, our file path actually doesn't have a file name. Let me go ahead and fix that real quick. I'm just going to name this Minecraft Cycles test underscore v001 and then underscore again, because it's going to add a frame number at the end there. And then I'm just going to go ahead and hit Control F12, or you can hit this animation button right here. And that should give us a series of images in the test folder that we just went ahead and created earlier. And it'll be different PNGs, each with a frame number at the end of it, that will end up being an image sequence that we can then import back into Blender in our video sequence editor, and then stitch that together into a video, and maybe add some sound in there as well. We'll do some sound editing in the next tutorial, so I'll see you guys in that one after this is done rendering, and I hope you guys learned something.